The first sign that something was wrong came from a foul stench seeping through the cold morning air. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes, thick and nauseating, something deeply wrong in the way it settled in your lungs. Officer Ryan Calloway had been on the force long enough to recognize the scent of decay. He didn't need the sanitation workers' frantic gestures to know that whatever was trapped in the drain wasn't an ordinary piece of garbage. Anchorage, Alaska, had seen its share of grim discoveries. The frozen landscape had a way of hiding secrets, swallowing them under thick layers of ice and time. But this was something else. Ryan pulled on his gloves and stepped forward as his partner, Detective Lisa Monroe, crouched by the metal grate. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the unmistakable outline of a body. The moment she saw it, she stiffened. "Jesus Christ," she muttered under her breath. It wasn't just a body. It was wrapped in a blanket, stuffed deep into the storm drain like a piece of discarded waste. The fabric, soaked through from the damp, clung tightly to the lifeless form inside. Ryan swallowed hard. He had seen things in his career, terrible things, but there was always something uniquely unnatural about a body being hidden like this, a desperation to make it disappear. Monroe reached for her radio. "Dispatch, we have a possible 1054, requesting CSI and coroner at my location." There was a pause before the reply. "Copy that. Units en route." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the discovery settle. The sanitation worker who had called them in was standing a few feet away, his face pale, hands trembling. I thought it was a dead animal," he stammered. "Then I saw a hand." Monroe nodded, her face unreadable. "You did the right thing calling it in." Ryan exhaled sharply and crouched closer to the drain. The smell was stronger now, human decay mixed with damp earth and rusted metal. Carefully, he peeled back part of the blanket, revealing the first glimpse of what lay beneath. A woman. Her skin was pale, lips slightly parted as if frozen in a final gasp. There was no blood, at least none visible at first glance. But something about the way her head lolled to the side made Ryan's gut tighten. A gunshot wound, straight to the head, execution style. Monroe muttered another curse. "This wasn't an accident," Ryan murmured. "Someone put her here. Someone wanted her to disappear." Elsewhere, at that very moment, in a small apartment across town, Zarrius Hildabrand poured himself a cup of coffee. The morning news played softly in the background, the anchors droning on about a local election, a cold front moving in. Nothing that mattered, nothing that hinted at what he had done. He took a sip, calm, composed. He had played his role perfectly. His wife had simply disappeared, and that was exactly how it was supposed to stay. The air inside Anchorage Police Department carried a stale weight, a mixture of old coffee, worn-out carpet, and the quiet hum of too many cases waiting to be solved. It was always like this in the early hours. Detectives hunched over paperwork, officers coming and going, the soft murmur of conversations about things most people never wanted to think about. Detective Lisa Monroe leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen in front of her, waiting for the missing persons database to load. The body from the storm drain had been sent to the medical examiner hours ago, and the forensic team was still working on identification. But something about it gnawed at her. The way the body had been wrapped in a blanket, the careful disposal, the lack of any immediate evidence of a struggle. It wasn't random. The system finally loaded. Her eyes narrowed at the search result blinking on the screen. One match. Saria Hildabrand, 21 years old, active duty military medic, reported missing 48 hours ago by a close friend. Last seen by her husband, Zarrius Hildabrand. Monroe's fingers tapped against the desk. The details of the report were sparse. The husband had stated that she left for work early in the morning and never came back. That alone raised a red flag. Anchorage wasn't a city where people just disappeared, not without a trace, and certainly not military personnel, women trained for survival, who carried themselves with awareness. She pulled up the rest of the report, scanning quickly. A name stood out, the friend who had filed the report. Melissa Carter. Monroe exhaled and reached for the phone. It rang twice before a nervous voice answered. "Hello? This is Detective Monroe with the Anchorage Police Department. I need to ask you some questions about Saria Hildabrand. There was silence on the other end, followed by a sharp inhale. Have you found her? Melissa's voice was tight, anxious. Monroe didn't answer right away. When was the last time you saw her? 2 nights ago. We had drinks after work. She was off. Off how? Quiet, distracted. I asked her about it, but she just brushed it off. She said she was tired. And the last time you heard from her? That night. I texted her. She replied that everything was fine, but it didn't sound like her. It was too, she hesitated, too cold. Monroe scribbled notes on the side of the missing persons report. A sudden shift in tone, a generic response, a classic sign of someone who either didn't want to talk or couldn't. When did you realize something was wrong? Monroe asked. When she didn't show up to work. Saria is never late, never. Monroe nodded, even though Melissa couldn't see her. Military discipline. A woman like Saria didn't just abandon her life overnight. She flipped through more details on the report. The husband hadn't called the police. He hadn't reported her missing. It had been Melissa. Monroe felt the weight of that in her gut. How well do you know her husband? She asked. There was another pause, this one heavier. Not well, Melissa admitted. They got married fast. She barely introduced him to anyone. It was weird. Monroe's pen stopped mid-note. Weird how? Melissa hesitated again. She didn't talk about him much, and when she did, it was always careful, like she was choosing her words. That was enough for Monroe. She'd been on the force long enough to know when a case was leading somewhere dark. The next step was obvious. She needed to talk to Zarrius Hildabrand. The apartment was small, barely furnished, the kind of place that felt temporary, like the people inside it never intended to stay. Zarrius stood in the kitchen, a half-empty coffee mug on the counter beside him. The television hummed in the background, playing some morning talk show he wasn't paying attention to. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He had practiced this moment in his head. He had known the police would come eventually. It was inevitable. There was a knock at the door. He waited a beat, counted to 3, then opened it. A female detective stood there, badge clipped to her belt, her expression unreadable. Zarrius Hildabrand. He nodded, keeping his face neutral. Yeah, I'm Detective Lisa Monroe. I'd like to ask you some questions about your wife. His grip tightened slightly on the doorknob. He forced his shoulders to stay relaxed. Of course, he said. Come in. He led her inside, gesturing vaguely to the couch. She didn't sit. When was the last time you saw Saria? He had rehearsed his answer a dozen times. She left for work early that morning. I haven't seen her since. Monroe tilted her head slightly. You didn't think to report her missing? He shrugged, careful not to seem defensive. I thought she needed space. She's independent like that. Monroe didn't react. She just studied him for a moment. Where were you that night? Home? Alone? Yes. Did anyone see you? His jaw tightened just slightly before he forced another easy shrug. Number I was here. Monroe let the silence stretch, waiting to see if he'd fill it. He didn't. Instead, he just stood there, completely still. She had met plenty of men like him, men who thought stillness meant innocence. But in her experience, the innocent ones always fidgeted. She let the tension hang for a moment longer before flipping her notebook closed. If you think of anything else, call me. She handed him her card. He took it with a nod, still expressionless. Monroe turned and walked to the door, but before she stepped out, she glanced back over her shoulder. There was something wrong with him. She could feel it in her bones. But feelings weren't enough. She needed proof, and she was going to find it. In the dim light of his apartment, Zarrius watched her leave, his fingers tightening around the card in his hand. Everything was fine. He just had to keep it that way. The city of Anchorage was still waking up as the first rays of sunlight pushed through the thick gray clouds. The night's frost had settled over the streets, glazing parked cars with a thin layer of ice. The cold had a way of creeping into everything, seeping through walls, settling into bones. It was a city that could swallow secrets, where the silence of winter nights made it too easy for terrible things to happen unnoticed. Inside the sterile confines of the Anchorage Medical Examiner's office, Dr. Hannah Reyes adjusted her gloves and took a deep breath. She had worked hundreds of cases, seen the worst of what people could do to each other, but there was always something unsettling about a young victim, a life cut short long before its time. The body of Saria Hildabrand lay motionless on the examination table, the harsh fluorescent lighting turning her skin a waxy shade of pale. The medical examiner's office was quiet except for the soft hum of equipment and the occasional scratch of Dr. Reyes' pen against her clipboard. She started with the external examination. No visible signs of prolonged struggle, no defensive wounds, no bruises consistent with a physical altercation. That in itself was telling. It suggested one of two things. Either the victim had been completely unaware of the attack until the final moment, or she had been unable to fight back. Her fingers moved to the gunshot wound. A single bullet, entry point behind the left ear, a clean trajectory. The angle was precise, execution style. Whoever had done this hadn't hesitated. There was no hesitation wound, no evidence of an errant shot or panic. This was controlled, deliberate. She made a note of it. The next step was examining the condition of the body before death. The victim's skin and muscle tone suggested she had been killed approximately 36 to 48 hours before discovery. That aligned with the reported time frame of her disappearance. But there was something else. A faint mark on her wrist, partially faded, but still visible under the right lighting. Bruising, a restraint, a grip. It was hard to say for certain, but it raised questions. More notes, more photos. Every detail mattered. The forensic technician entered the room, his gloves snapping into place as he carefully handled a sealed bag containing a sample collected from the body. "We pulled fibers from the blanket she was wrapped in," he said. "It's a match to the ones found in her apartment." Dr. Reyes exhaled slowly. That was a critical piece of evidence. Whoever had wrapped her body had access to her home, to her belongings. This hadn't been some random abduction. She turned back to the table, to the lifeless form of a woman who had, until so recently, been full of life. The autopsy would tell a story, it always did. And this one, she suspected, was just beginning. Detective Monroe stared at the whiteboard in her office, the victim's name now scrawled in red marker. The case had shifted from a missing persons report to a full-scale homicide investigation in less than 24 hours. The body had confirmed what she had already suspected. Saria Hildabrand hadn't just vanished. Someone had made her disappear. The problem now was figuring out who. Monroe had spent the last 6 hours combing through Saria's phone records, bank statements, and personal history. There were no immediate red flags, no debts, no secret accounts, no suspicious withdrawals. If she had been afraid of something, she hadn't left a financial trail to prove it. But then there were the text messages. The last ones sent from Saria's phone had been to Melissa Carter, the friend who had reported her missing. Monroe had read them over and over, something about them gnawing at her. "Everything's fine. Just a long day. Talk soon." It was too cold, too impersonal. Melissa had been right. It didn't sound like a woman texting her best friend. It sounded like a message meant to create distance, to buy time. The husband, Zarrius Hildabrand, was still an unknown variable. His interview had been frustratingly vague. He had said all the right things. Concerned husband, worried but hopeful, but something about his demeanor had been off. He was too controlled, too careful. Monroe had been doing this long enough to know when someone was holding something back. The problem was she didn't have enough to push harder. Yet, the forensic team was still processing evidence from the crime scene, and until she had physical proof linking someone to the body, all she had was suspicion. She turned to the missing person's timeline, tracing Saria's movements in the days leading up to her disappearance. She had last been seen by her co-workers the night before. No reports of distress, no complaints of trouble at home, just another normal day. And then she was gone. Monroe tapped her pen against the desk. Something was missing. People didn't just disappear without warning. There was always something. A moment of hesitation, an argument, a shift in routine. The question was, had anyone noticed it before it was too late? She picked up her phone and scrolled to the number of Saria's commanding officer. If anyone had insight into her behavior before she vanished, it would be someone who worked with her every day. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Major Beckett speaking? Major, this is Detective Lisa Monroe with the Anchorage PD. I'm investigating the disappearance and death of one of your soldiers, Saria Hildabrand. I was hoping to ask you a few questions. There was a brief pause, then a quiet sigh. Go ahead. Monroe leaned back in her chair. When was the last time you saw her? About 2 days before she was reported missing. She worked her normal shift. Didn't say much, but that wasn't unusual for her. Did she seem different? Distracted? Upset? Another pause. Maybe, now that I think about it, she wasn't as talkative as usual. She was professional, always did her job, but I remember thinking something was on her mind. I asked if she was okay, and she said she was just tired. Monroe wrote it down. Another person who had noticed something off. Did she ever mention her husband? Beckett hesitated. Not really. She didn't talk about her personal life much. But a few months ago, she mentioned they got married fast. Quieter than usual after that. Monroe's pen stopped mid-sentence. That was interesting. Did she ever seem afraid of him? A long silence. I can't say for sure, but looking back, I think she was carrying something. Something she didn't want to say out loud. Monroe thanked him and ended the call. The feeling in her gut grew stronger. Saria had been trying to keep something buried, and Monroe was going to dig it up. She turned back to the whiteboard, her eyes landing on the husband's name, Zarrius Hildabrand. If he was hiding something, she was going to find out what. The Anchorage winter held an unforgiving chill, a quiet force that wrapped around the city and settled into its bones. The streets were lined with remnants of snow, the kind that never fully melted, but instead hardened into uneven patches of ice, a constant reminder of the cold that never truly left. Detective Lisa Monroe sat at her desk, the white fluorescent light overhead buzzing softly. The case file lay open in front of her, its pages filled with statements, reports, and carefully documented timelines. Somewhere within these pages was the truth. It was buried beneath the carefully rehearsed words, hidden between the lines of seemingly ordinary details. She had spent the last few hours analyzing everything. Saria's last known movements, her bank records, her text messages. The puzzle was slowly coming together, though there were still missing pieces. Something had shifted in the final days of Saria's life. A change subtle enough that most people had brushed it off, but not Monroe. She had seen it too many times before. The small silences, the carefully worded reassurances, the way friends and coworkers looked back and realized that what seemed like a simple bad day was something far worse. A woman unraveling, without anyone noticing until it was too late. The most telling detail so far wasn't what had been said, but rather what hadn't. Saria had vanished without a struggle, without a call for help, no forced entry, no clear signs of an intruder. Either she had left willingly or the danger had come from within her own walls. Monroe tapped her pen against the desk, her mind circling around the husband, Zarrius Hildabrand. He had been calm, too calm. His answers had been clean, practiced. He had said all the right things, but none of the true ones. The fact that he hadn't reported her missing was damning on its own. It was always the same pattern. When someone went missing, the person closest to them should have been the first one to panic, the first one to call for help. Instead, it had been Saria's friend Melissa who had noticed something was wrong. That spoke volumes. Monroe turned her focus to the night Saria had vanished. According to Zarrius, she had left the apartment early that morning to walk to work. A simple story, but one that fell apart under scrutiny. There were no witnesses who had seen her on that route. No security cameras had captured her. And Saria, according to everyone who knew her, would never have simply walked alone in the dark, which meant she had never left that apartment, or at the very least not on her own. Monroe glanced at the clock. It was late, but she wasn't leaving. The forensic team was still processing evidence from the apartment, and the results would be coming in soon. That was what she needed. Physical proof. Suspicion wasn't enough. Gut feelings didn't hold up in court. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the sound sharp against the quiet hum of the precinct. She reached for it without hesitation. Forensic report, preliminary findings attached. She exhaled slowly, opening the file. The document loaded, line after line of meticulously recorded observations filling the screen. Traces of human blood found in bedroom, partially cleaned. Fibers from the blanket found in the storm drain. Match fibers recovered from the apartment. Surveillance footage from local convenience store confirms Zarrius Hildabrand purchasing cleaning supplies the morning after Saria was last seen. Monroe's jaw tightened. There it was. Not enough for a conviction, not yet, but enough to start pulling at the thread until everything unraveled. She flipped back to the crime scene photos, letting herself absorb the full weight of what she was seeing. The body had been wrapped in a blanket from their home. A small detail, but one that mattered. It was personal. It spoke to an attempt at concealment, not just of the crime itself, but of what had been done. This hadn't been a simple act of violence. It had been controlled, calculated. Monroe closed the file and rubbed a hand over her face. The forensic team would run more tests, but she already knew what they would find. Blood had a way of telling the truth, no matter how hard someone tried to erase it. Zarrius Hildabrand had cleaned. He had tried to wipe away the evidence, but he hadn't been careful enough. There was always something left behind. Across town, the apartment was silent. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of cleaning chemicals that did little to mask what lingered beneath. The floor had been scrubbed, the sheets washed, the surfaces wiped down with practiced precision. But no amount of bleach could change what had happened there. Zarrius sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, his expression unreadable. He had done everything right. He had followed the plan. But plans had flaws, mistakes. He thought about the police detective who had stood in his living room, the way she had looked at him, not with open suspicion, but with careful, quiet study. She had been measuring him, testing the weight of his words. She knew, not everything, not yet, but she knew enough to start looking in places he didn't want her to. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax. There was nothing linking him to the body. He had made sure of that. Still, doubt lingered. The waiting was the hardest part. The hours stretched long, filled with the ghost of her voice, the echo of her presence, the way she used to stand at the kitchen counter, humming under her breath, the way she laughed. Too bright, too full, too much. His hands curled into fists. He had given her everything, a home, a future, and she had been ready to throw it all away. She had wanted to leave, but leaving wasn't an option. Not then, not now. The television flickered as the late-night news played in the background. The anchor's voice was steady, detached. Another crime, another statistic. Anchorage had seen its share of bodies. People got lost in the cold, in the dark, in the silence. That was the thing about this city. It could make people disappear, and no one would ever find them. Zarrius closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. Everything was fine. It had to be. The air inside the forensic lab was crisp and sterile, carrying the faint scent of disinfectant and paper. The kind of atmosphere that stripped away the weight of the outside world and left nothing but cold facts and raw evidence. Detective Lisa Monroe stood near the examination table, arms crossed, watching as the forensic analyst carefully examined the fibers retrieved from the storm drain. Every movement was precise, every tool laid out with intention, as if the truth was something that could be pulled from a microscope slide, extracted from a single strand of thread. The preliminary forensic report had already established that the blanket wrapped around Saria Hildabrand's body came from her apartment, but now came the deeper work, analyzing everything else found at the scene, searching for the microscopic traces that killers always left behind, even when they thought they had been careful. Blood, hair, skin cells, something. Monroe knew from experience that crimes committed in passion were never perfect. When someone acted on impulse, whether out of rage, fear, or desperation, they always made mistakes. Even the ones who cleaned, the ones who planned, the ones who thought they had covered their tracks, always left something behind. She shifted slightly, feeling the weight of the case settling deeper into her chest. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many details that felt off, like puzzle pieces that had been forced together but didn't quite fit. She had been reviewing Saria's phone records for the past hour, searching for anything unusual, and one detail stood out. There were no outgoing calls or texts from Saria after her final message to her best friend Melissa. Not one. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist the moment she sent that text, as if every part of her life had been put on pause. Monroe had seen this pattern before. Victims didn't just stop communicating. Even when they wanted to be alone, even when they were angry, there was always something, a final call, a social media post, a transaction, some indication that they were still alive, still moving through the world. But with Saria, there was nothing. And then there was the husband. Monroe pulled out Zarrius Hildabrand's financial records again, skimming through his recent purchases. The receipt from the convenience store was there. The cleaning supplies, the bleach. But another transaction caught her eye. A gas station purchase. Late at night. Only a few hours after Saria was last seen. She opened the report from the scene. The storm drain where the body had been discovered was less than half a mile from that gas station. It wasn't a smoking gun, not yet, but it was another crack in his story. She exhaled, her gaze flicking back to the forensic analyst as he carefully sealed a test sample. They wouldn't have DNA results for a few more days, but she already knew what they would find. There was something about cases like this. You could feel the truth pressing against you, waiting to be uncovered. It was there in the gaps, in the inconsistencies, in the small things that, on their own, meant nothing, but when pieced together, created a picture that couldn't be ignored. Monroe turned and left the lab, her mind already racing through the next steps. She needed surveillance footage from that gas station. She needed a closer look at the apartment. She needed to see if Zarrius had ever bought a gun. She wasn't just chasing leads anymore. She was closing in. The apartment was cold, the kind of cold that settled deep into the walls, lingering long after the heating had been turned off. Zarrius Hildabrand sat alone, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the small, dimly lit space. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curled slightly, as if waiting for something that wasn't coming. The last 48 hours had passed in a haze, each moment stretching endlessly, folding into the next with a weight he couldn't quite shake. He had done everything right. He had made sure there were no mistakes. But the silence was beginning to feel like a presence. Something alive, something pressing against him. He thought about the detective, the way she had stood in his living room, studying him, the way she had asked her questions, not with outright suspicion, but with something deeper, something sharper. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't just going through the motions. She was looking for something, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it hidden. He pushed himself to his feet, moving toward the window. The street below was quiet, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. For a brief moment, he thought about leaving, just packing up, walking away, disappearing before they could piece it all together. But no, that wasn't an option. Not yet. He had planned for this. He had known it would be difficult, that there would be questions, that people would look at him differently, but he also knew that as long as there was no proof, they couldn't touch him. He just had to wait it out. The thought should have been comforting, but it wasn't, because deep down, he knew the truth always had a way of surfacing, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it buried. Back at the precinct, Monroe sat at her desk, scrolling through surveillance footage from the gas station. The timestamps matched the transaction. Late at night, just a few hours after Saria had supposedly left for work. And then she saw it. A figure moving near the trash bins, carrying something heavy. The footage was grainy, the angles limited, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone had been there, disposing of something. She leaned forward, pressing pause. The screen flickered, the image frozen. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to prove one thing. Zarrius Hildabrand had been lying, and now she had to prove why. The streets of Anchorage remained eerily quiet in the early morning hours, the sky still dark with the lingering traces of night. A soft mist hung in the air, clinging to the pavement and blurring the harsh glow of streetlights. The city at this hour belonged to those who lurked in the shadows, the forgotten, the restless, and sometimes those who carried secrets too heavy to keep buried. Detective Lisa Monroe sat at her desk, her fingers methodically scrolling through the grainy surveillance footage from the gas station near the storm drain where Saria Hildabrand's body had been found. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the transaction records from Zarrius Hildabrand's credit card, the purchase barely noticeable among the seemingly mundane string of transactions. He had bought nothing that screamed of guilt, nothing that would immediately catch a trained investigator's eye. But Monroe had learned long ago that criminals rarely made their mistakes in broad daylight. They slipped up in the margins, in the spaces they thought no one would look. The figure in the footage moved with deliberate caution, careful but not rushed, as if trying to maintain normalcy while carrying out something undeniably suspicious. Monroe could see the tension in the way he walked, the stiff control in his posture, the unnatural stillness that people only had when they were hyper-aware of their own movements. It was the body language of a man who wasn't just throwing out trash. It was someone getting rid of something they didn't want anyone to find. She rewound the footage, slowing it down frame by frame. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, making it difficult to get a clear look at his face. But the build was right. The height, the way he moved. It was all too close to be coincidence. She exhaled, leaning back in her chair, her eyes burning from staring at the screen for too long. This was enough to press harder, enough to put the pressure where it needed to be. Zarrius had been out that night, and he had lied about it. But a lie wasn't a conviction. She needed more. The forensic results from the apartment would take another day, maybe two. The fibers from the blanket, the traces of blood, they would tell a story more damning than any interrogation ever could. But until then, she had to keep pushing, keep unraveling the carefully woven narrative of innocence that Zarrius had tried to build around himself. She pulled up the crime scene photos again, letting her eyes move over them slowly, deliberately. The body wrapped tightly in the familiar fabric, placed just far enough away to suggest an attempt at distance, but not far enough to erase the connection. He hadn't taken her to the woods. He hadn't dumped her in the river. He had chosen somewhere close, somewhere convenient, because he hadn't expected them to find her so soon. The thought sent a cold chill through her. Had he planned to move the body again? Had they caught this case in its earliest stage, before he had a chance to cover his tracks more thoroughly? It wasn't uncommon. Killers often underestimated how quickly a missing person case could turn into a homicide investigation. She tapped her pen against her desk, letting her mind work through the logic. Zarrius had panicked. He had made a mistake. And now the walls were closing in. She stood, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. It was time to look at the apartment again. The apartment building stood in a quiet, unremarkable part of town, the kind of place that people passed every day without ever really seeing. The parking lot was half empty, the dim lighting casting uneven shadows against the pavement. Monroe took in the details as she approached, the worn paint on the railings, the faint scuff marks near the stairs, the subtle imperfections that came from life moving through a space in small, unintentional ways. The door to Unit 306 looked the same as before, the same as any other in the complex, but there was something about it that felt heavier now. The knowledge of what had happened here had changed the air itself. She knocked once, sharp and authoritative, and when no answer came, she used the key provided by the building's manager to let herself in. The inside was painfully neat, the kind of cleanliness that didn't feel lived in, as if someone had gone out of their way to erase all traces of life. The couch was perfectly aligned with the coffee table. The kitchen counter was spotless, the sink empty, everything in its place, everything too controlled. Monroe stepped further inside, her eyes scanning for what didn't belong, for what had been scrubbed too hard or hidden too well. The bedroom was the same, clean, ordered, but no matter how much someone wiped away, blood had a way of lingering. She stood in the center of the room, imagining how it had happened. Had she been asleep? Had she even seen it coming? The autopsy suggested no signs of struggle, no bruising consistent with a fight. It had been fast, precise, a single gunshot, close range, and then the silence. Monroe turned, running her fingers lightly over the edge of the nightstand. The bed had been made too neatly, the kind of precision that wasn't natural. People's bedrooms had a rhythm, an unspoken imprint of how they moved through their space, and this one felt too much like a set piece. She stepped back, exhaling. This was where it happened. She could feel it. Even if there was no blood visible to the naked eye, she knew the forensic team would find it in the fibers, in the microscopic spaces where it had seeped in before being wiped away. No matter how carefully someone cleaned, there were always remnants. She walked through the rest of the apartment slowly, absorbing everything. The way the air felt stale, like a place that had been waiting too long for someone who was never coming back. The framed photos on the shelves, the smiling images of a couple that no longer existed. The illusion of a life still intact, even as it unraveled. Monroe took one last look before stepping back into the hallway, locking the door behind her. There was no doubt in her mind anymore. Zarrius Hildabrand hadn't lost his wife. He had taken her life, and now all that was left was to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. She just needed one final piece, one undeniable truth that he couldn't clean away. The air in the precinct carried a weight of exhaustion, a kind that settled deep into the bones of those who had spent too many hours chasing answers that refused to come easily. The hum of overhead lights droned quietly, casting a sterile glow over the stacks of paperwork that cluttered Detective Lisa Monroe's desk. It was well past midnight, but the day had yet to end for her. The case had shifted from a search for a missing woman to a hunt for a murderer, and with every passing hour, the net tightened around Zarrius Hildabrand. Yet there were still pieces of the puzzle that refused to snap into place, still gaps in the timeline that left room for doubt. Room for him to continue his performance of the grieving husband just a little while longer, but not for much longer. Monroe stared at the screen in front of her, the grainy gas station footage playing on loop. The figure, a man of similar build to Zarrius, moved quickly, dropping something into the trash bin behind the building. There were no identifying markers, no clear image of a face, but it was enough to prove one thing. Zarrius had lied about where he had been the night his wife disappeared. The weight of that deception pressed against Monroe's mind. People lied in investigations all the time. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to poke holes in his carefully crafted story, enough to push harder, to see where the cracks would start to form. Her phone buzzed beside her, and she reached for it without looking away from the footage. The forensic lab had sent its latest report, preliminary DNA analysis from the blood recovered in the apartment. She opened the file, scanning quickly. Partial match to victim. Trace amounts found in bedroom and bathroom consistent with an attempt at cleanup. There it was. It wasn't the kind of evidence that would hold up alone, not yet, but it was the beginning of a thread that would unravel everything. Blood, even in the smallest amounts, told a story. And this story was becoming clearer with every new discovery. Saria Hildabrand had never walked out of her apartment that morning. She had never left for work, and Monroe was willing to bet that the last thing she had seen wasn't the sunrise, but the barrel of a gun held by the man who was supposed to love her. She sat back, exhaling slowly, letting the information settle in her mind. Every case had a tipping point, the moment when the weight of the evidence became too heavy to ignore. She could feel them approaching that moment now. The only thing left was to see how Zarrius Hildabrand would respond when he realized his lies were starting to collapse around him. Across town, inside a dimly lit apartment that had once been filled with laughter and conversation, Zarrius sat in silence, staring at the flickering television screen in front of him. The late-night news played on, the anchor's voice a distant hum, but he wasn't really listening. He had barely left the apartment all day, his phone untouched on the coffee table, his thoughts circling like vultures over a carcass. The past few days had stretched endlessly, each hour carrying a growing sense of something he couldn't quite define. Dread. He had expected this process, had told himself he was prepared, that as long as he stayed calm, as long as he controlled the narrative, it would be fine. But it wasn't fine. He could feel it shifting. Something was slipping. The detective had come to his door once already, her eyes sharp, her questions careful, and she had left with the kind of quiet certainty that made his skin crawl. She knew. Maybe not everything. Not yet. But she knew enough. His fingers tightened around the armrest of the couch, his breathing steady but shallow. He had planned for this, had accounted for the questions, the suspicions, But the problem with planning for disaster was that once it started, it never unraveled the way you expected. He thought about the last time he had seen Saria alive. The way she had looked at him, her expression caught somewhere between sadness and resignation, as if she had already decided what was coming. She had wanted to leave. She had thought she could just walk away, start over, erase him from her life. She hadn't understood. He had built something for them, given her everything, and she had been ready to throw it all away. That wasn't how it worked. Not for him, not for them. His gaze flickered to the small drawer beneath the television stand, the one that held her phone, still turned off, still waiting. He should have gotten rid of it, should have thrown it away that night, but he hadn't. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because it was the last part of her that still remained. Or maybe because, deep down, he had wanted to keep something of hers, even after everything else was gone. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He stilled. For a long moment, he didn't move. The knock came again, firm, deliberate. His stomach twisted. He already knew who it was. The walls were closing in. Monroe stood outside Unit 306, her hands in the pockets of her coat, her breath curling in the cold air as she waited. The knock had echoed through the quiet hallway, but there was no sound from inside, no movement. She wasn't leaving, not this time. She had come to talk, but more than that, she had come to watch, to see how Zarrius Hildabrand handled pressure now that he knew the game was shifting. She knocked again, this time harder. The seconds dragged on, stretching into minutes. And then finally the sound of footsteps, slow, measured. The door creaked open just enough to reveal him, standing in the dim light, his face composed, but his eyes were wrong. Tired, hollow, calculating. For the first time since this had started, Monroe could see the fear creeping in at the edges. She had him. He just didn't know it yet. The moment the door creaked open, Detective Lisa Monroe knew. It wasn't the slight hesitation in Zarrius Hildabrand's movements, nor was it the way his expression barely shifted as he stood in the dim glow of the hallway. It was something deeper, something beneath the surface, a carefully constructed mask beginning to slip. The tension in the air felt heavier than it had before, thick with something unspoken, something unsustainable. Zarrius had spent the last few days walking a fragile tightrope, balancing himself between a story that was coming apart at the seams and the quiet panic that grew sharper with every passing hour. Monroe had seen this before, the moment when a suspect started realizing they weren't going to get away with it. She had seen it in men who had tried to convince themselves that they could rewrite the past, that if they lied well enough, if they held their ground long enough, reality itself would bend in their favor. But the truth had a weight that lies couldn't hold forever, and now it was pressing down on him, suffocating him, sinking into his skin. Zarrius moved aside, wordlessly allowing her in. The apartment was just as lifeless as before, the silence stretching through the space like something waiting to be filled. It was too clean, too carefully arranged, as if the very act of scrubbing the floors and straightening the furniture could erase what had happened here. But it hadn't. Monroe could feel it in the air, the way spaces carried their own history, the way walls remembered even when people tried to forget. She took in the details with the same quiet patience she always had, letting her eyes drift over the carefully positioned objects, the spotless surfaces. The apartment wasn't just clean, it was sterile, as if someone had gone to great lengths to remove any trace of life from it. But people weren't ghosts, and no amount of scrubbing could undo the past. The forensic reports had already confirmed what she suspected. Traces of Saria's blood had been found here, soaked into the fibers, too deep to wash away completely. The weight of that knowledge settled over Monroe as she turned, her gaze resting on Zarrius for just a moment longer than necessary. He hadn't moved much since letting her in, his body held in a state of forced stillness, a man caught between two choices, fight or flee, deny or confess. She had seen this before too. The slow unraveling of a story told too many times, the creeping realization that the walls were closing in. The performance was slipping. The act of playing the grieving husband was becoming exhausting, unsustainable. She imagined what it must have been like in the hours after it happened. The way he must have stood here, heart pounding, mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. The decisions he made in that moment had led him here, to this place where the truth was no longer something he could outrun. And yet, he still clung to the illusion of control. Zarrius shifted slightly, his fingers flexing at his sides before stilling again, as if willing himself to remain composed, to play the role he had rehearsed in his mind. But Monroe knew better. The cracks were already showing. The weight of his own lie was breaking him apart inch by inch. She turned away from him then, walking further into the apartment, her movements slow and deliberate, absorbing everything. This wasn't a space where a man waited anxiously for news of his missing wife. It wasn't a space filled with grief, with uncertainty, with longing for answers. It was the space of a man who already knew the truth, a man who had spent every waking moment since that night trying to make sure no one else would. But it hadn't worked, because Monroe had found her, and now it was only a matter of time before she had everything else she needed. She could already picture it, the final moments, the way Saria must have stood in this very room, perhaps with her back turned, unaware of what was about to happen. Or maybe she had known. Maybe she had seen the shift in his eyes, the same shift Monroe saw now. Maybe in that last second before the gun fired, she had realized that the man she had once trusted had become her executioner. The thought settled in Monroe's chest like a stone. Saria hadn't just died. She had been erased, wrapped up, hidden away, discarded like an inconvenience, as if her life had only ever existed as an extension of his. As if, the moment she stopped fitting into the version of reality he had built, he had simply decided to eliminate her from it. Monroe had seen this kind of control before. It was never about anger, never about passion. It was about ownership. Zarrius had decided that if he couldn't have her, if she refused to be his in the way he expected, then no one could. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Zarrius hadn't said a word since she stepped inside. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. Monroe turned back toward him, the weight of her stare pressing into him like an unseen force. She wasn't here to question him. She wasn't here to ask for his version of events. She was here to watch him unravel, and he knew it. He knew it the same way she did. The same way a man standing at the edge of a crumbling bridge knows the moment his footing gives way. It was happening. He just hadn't decided whether he was going to run or fall. And the moment he made that choice, Monroe would be waiting. Because there was no getting away from this. Not anymore. The first time Zarrius Hildabrand had sat in an interrogation room, he had worn his best performance. The grieving husband, the concerned soldier, the man who had no idea where his wife had gone. But now he wasn't performing anymore. Now he was just waiting for the inevitable. The room was small, windowless, and silent except for the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The air smelled of old coffee and paper, of cases long closed and confessions ripped from mouths that had once sworn their innocence. The metal chair beneath him was cold, grounding him in a reality he had spent days trying to outrun. His wrists ached from the handcuffs locked tightly around them, the weight of steel pressing into his skin like a brand. He was no longer in control. Across the table, Detective Lisa Monroe sat with her hands folded, watching him with the same steady gaze she had carried from the moment she had first knocked on his door. She had always known. Not at first, maybe. Not when she had stood outside his apartment that day, waiting for him to open the door with a look of practiced concern. But soon after. She had known from the way he spoke, from the way he had tried too hard not to say the wrong thing, from the way his words had been too clean, too careful. Men who lost their wives didn't act like that. And now she had proof. The evidence was airtight. Bloodstains in the apartment, DNA on the blanket, the gas station surveillance footage. But it wasn't just the forensics that had unraveled his story. It was the weight of his own lies, the way they had stacked on top of each other until the entire structure collapsed. There had been no forced entry, no sign of a struggle. Saria had died in her own home, in a place she should have been safe, at the hands of the person she should have been able to trust the most. And then he had wrapped her in a blanket, driven her body less than a mile away, and stuffed her into a storm drain like she was nothing more than a problem to be solved. Monroe leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. They found everything, Zarrius. He didn't speak. Not yet. Not because he was planning his next move, but because there were no moves left to make. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the walls like a storm waiting to break. She slid a single photograph across the table. Saria's body, the way she had been found. His eyes flickered downward, but he didn't react. Monroe had seen it before, the way killers sometimes became detached from their own crimes, as if the person they had killed had never really been real to them in the first place. And maybe to him, she never had been. Maybe she had been an extension of himself, a possession, something that had belonged to him until she had tried to leave. And that was the part he had never been able to accept. She could see it in him now, the realization that the lie was over, that no matter what words he tried to put together, no matter how many times he opened his mouth only to close it again, there was no way out. His fingers twitched slightly, a useless, involuntary movement, as if his body still hadn't caught up with the reality of what was happening. He had lost, and in the end, all he had left was the truth. Monroe didn't need a confession. The jury wouldn't need it either. The trial was swift. The prosecution built their case with the kind of precision that left no room for doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before delivering their verdict. Guilty. And just like that, it was over. Monroe stood outside the courthouse steps the day they took him away, watching as the weight of justice finally settled on his shoulders. He didn't look back. He didn't fight. He walked forward with the kind of empty acceptance that came only when a man realized he was no longer the author of his own story. She thought about Saria then, about the way people had described her, bright, full of life, someone who had been loved and had deserved more than the fate she had been given. She thought about the last moments of her life, the fear she must have felt, the betrayal she must have seen in the eyes of the man she had once trusted. And she thought about how, in the end, Zarrius had failed to do the one thing he had set out to do. He had tried to erase her, but now her name would never be forgotten. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.